Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today we're going to be talking about coaching Generation Z athletes. And joining me today to talk about this are Dr. Julie Johnston and Joseph Stanford. Welcome both.
Hi.
Hi Dan, thanks for the invite.
Super excited to have you on. Today we're going to be talking all things coaching Generation Z athletes. But before we do, why don't we do some introductions? Joseph, you've been on the show before, so we'll reintroduce you in a second. Julie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi Dan, thanks for having us on. So I guess my background, I'm currently a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University in sports psychology. My interest is and always has been at the applied side of sports psychology. So I teach on the practical applications module of second year. And then that translates a lot into my research. So when I'm kind of conducting any kind of research, I'm always really keen to consider what the applied implications of that is and to try and make it as practical as possible for coaches, parents, athletes. I've got a particular interest in swimming, as we'll talk about today, because that's the focus of the study that we're probably going to discuss today. I was an ex-international athlete, a swimmer myself, so I competed for Ireland for about 10 years. Feels like a lifetime ago now, mind you. But yeah, so I like to think I bring to my work both that theoretical side of things in terms of the knowledge with the research and academic aspects, but also having been an athlete and competed at a high level, like to think I can bring that insight to my work and the work that I do with coaches and parents also.
Julie, did your interest in sports psychology emerge from competing in swimming? Is that how your interest started?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, I mean, it's as I say, it feels a long time ago now, but yes, I know when I was thinking about going to university, so right back sort of when I was 16, 17, I always knew psychology was what I was interested in, and sports psychology particularly. And then through my own career, that was heightened, I guess. And actually, interestingly, my PhD studies really kind of came out of my own experiences within sport, and a lot of what I focused on and now I continue to focus on comes from my own kind of reflections of some of the pros and cons of swimming and competing at a high level.
When you do reflect back on your competitive swimming, was the psychological side a strength for you? Were you mentally skillful? Was that an area when you look back, you think, wow, I could have been so much better there?
I think there's definitely situations where I know I could have been so much better, and I could pinpoint a couple of different situations where I feel like I definitely choked, let's say.
Okay.
But then, in other areas, I think, when I was younger, interestingly, and a little bit more naive, I think I was a bit stronger it's kind of that aspect of once you start to know things, and a little bit of knowledge can sometimes be a dangerous thing. So yeah, there was that aspect as well in terms of once I started to really get into the psychological side, there was a bit of overthinking and whatnot probably occurred. So yeah, I think it's kind of a little bit more of something I could have worked a little bit more effectively on myself. Absolutely.
I think it's that interesting juxtaposition, isn't it, between knowing and doing. But I do wonder sometimes if young athletes have to go through that period of getting to know their sport, building that procedural and declarative knowledge, and then over time being able to accommodate that knowledge and being able to still perform with that knowledge in mind, if that makes sense. You do need to know stuff, but then you've got to be able to put your knowledge into practice, haven't you?
Yeah, you do. And I think you also need to be able to shut that off at times,
Yeah.
and kind of just perform and not think about the process
Yeah.
too much. We do talk about the process and process goals, etc., but it's just sometimes about kind of then focusing on the task at hand and not kind of getting too caught up in a lot of that.
As you say, you can get lost in the process. Joseph, great to see you again, mate. Great to have you back on.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me back on, Dan. I appreciate it.
Why don't you reintroduce yourself to the audience?
So I'm a full-time swimming coach based here in Nottinghamshire. and I'm also a PhD student at Nottingham Trent University, and my research looks at the role of personality in coach-athlete relationships. And just while you were talking then, Julie, I remember me and Julie go back a long time, because when I started to do my coaching qualifications, one of the modules was a psych module, and I did that with Julie in Nottinghamshire. So Julie knows me for a long time, since I started out on coaching.
Fantastic. And we're here to talk about Generation Z athletes, coaching Generation Z athletes. You've mentioned that's a real interest for you, Joseph. Is that something that's been on your radar since you started coaching?
Yeah, because the predominant athletes that I work with, especially in the sport of swimming, are of this generation. And obviously, there's lots of benefits to having a positive coach-athlete relationship. The idea that we have to work together in order to form a positive relationship, because fundamentally, the coach will see things that the athlete won't, and the athlete will understand things and feel things that the coach cannot. And therefore, that ability to build a positive relationship in this ever changing, ever challenging, more complex world that we seem to be getting into can only be a positive thing, and an area of research that really has not been looked at that much, that probably needed addressing.
Well, let's start by defining what a Generation Z athlete is, or what Generation Z is. Julie, take us through the definition of a Generation Z athlete.
So, Generation Z individuals are those that have been born from around 1996 up until about 2010. You can kind of go a year or so either side of that, depending on what research you kind of draw from. And I guess what makes this generation unique is that they are the first generation to grow up in a fully digital world. So, and the internet was obviously up and running by the time they were born. And over that sort of the last 20 years or so, the amount of digital input that we now have in the world, the amount of devices that they have access to, the amount of television, etc., and the amount of information that they have access to is just it's mind-blowing, really, if many of us think back to our own experiences as young children and sort of adolescents within our own upbringing. And therefore, that access to the digital world, to both the devices and the actual knowledge that provides them with, is considered to result in this generation requiring developing, I should say, a slightly different psychosocial skill set. So they've got different psychological, social, and emotional qualities and characteristics than previous generations may have had, due to kind of their interaction with and the way the world is now, the way they engage with the world and the way the world is presented to them. And that in turn, therefore, requires teachers, coaches, significant others, adults, to engage with these young people in potentially slightly different ways than what previously would have been required. So, it's not to say, and I think it's really important for me to kind of state quite clearly early on that we're not suggesting this generation is, worse or it's bad. It's kind of that message sometimes that the older generation, oh, it's not like it was years ago, and kids nowadays, that kind of thing. And that's not what we're trying to get across at all. It's trying to understand what areas that they are actually really strong in, but then are there any deficit areas that they have that are preventing them from actually utilizing some of those strengths to the best of their ability, and actually, and are we missing out in capitalizing on some of those strengths by not kind of trying to pull up some of those deficit areas, such as, for example, communication is something that comes out a lot within the research and within our own research also. they're really good. This generation is really good at communicating via digital means, but that in-person communication, for example, is more lacking for various reasons. And is that then preventing, them from engaging more effectively with the opportunities around them, with working more effectively with the coaches and parents that they have access to, for example?
Generation Z athletes are somewhere between, at the time of recording, somewhere between 12 and 26 years old. They've grown up in a socio-cultural environment that is very technologically driven. And so subsequently, as coaches, we need to expect certain characteristics from them. You've uncovered a few of those characteristics there, Julie. I mean, a question to either of you. Can you tell me more? Can you unpack these personality characteristics of Generation Z athletes a little more for me?
Yeah, so I think there's in sport. It should sort of start by saying there's not been an awful lot of research done previously. So
Okay.
Dan Gould published and colleagues published a paper in around 2020, and that was the first paper within sport that actually started to look at this and to unpack this. Prior to that, we do have a lot of research around the psychosocial skills and assets and life skills, etc., that young athletes should develop in order to help them be successful. But if we're trying to focus specifically on understanding some unique characteristics, there's not been an awful lot of work done. Some research outside of sport, looking at within education, is uncovered things around, like as I've mentioned, those communication skills, the fact that perhaps these young people have lower levels of confidence, shorter attention spans, and are kind of not able to engage. They require frequent feedback from coaches. They've maybe got a lack of independence. And so that kind of impacts in terms of the ways in which coaches may effectively engage these athletes. And so our first kind of step within this research was trying to get a sense of what coaches in swimming currently working with these athletes within these age ranges at a sort of fairly elite level. So we looked for coaches who are working with athletes of national standard and above. What they felt, what were they seeing in the kids that were in front of them, like the athletes that were in front of them? What characteristics and skills did they think they had that were like strengths, and what other areas did they feel that they were perhaps a little bit lacking in that was holding them back? So we came up with sort of the coaches came up with 6 different areas of strength. So they were able to articulate that swimmers were, as we said, good with their digital communication skills. They had a really high level of sport-specific knowledge. So because they had access to a lot of information, they were then really in tune with their sport and understanding their sport. Some other things which I think were quite unique and novel to this particular study was they suggested that swimmers were very aware of their feelings and they were quite willing to share how they felt. So there was, if they weren't feeling good about things, they were willing to tell the coach that. So that sort of message of it's okay to not be okay is sort of seems to be getting through, which is great. They were very tolerant and understanding of diversity. So again, that's reflective, I think, of the world that we live in, where we're trying to be a lot more tolerant, who are different from ourselves. And they're really good at utilizing the support that's being made available to them. So, as we said previously, that might have been seen as a lack of independence, but that's actually an asset in if you need support, actually trying to reach out and get that support. But then some of the other areas that coaches sort of identified was these poor in-person communication skills. There was a lack of delayed gratification. So the athletes were very aspirational. They set very high goals for themselves, but they kind of wanted them to happen quite quickly. They didn't necessarily see that process that maybe when they see people being successful, they see the success. They don't always see the journey that they've been on to get there.
Yeah.
And then some of the other things perhaps come together to suggest, some indications of perfectionism. So these athletes were considered to be highly self-critical. They were considered to have low levels of self-confidence, low levels of resilience. And then there was a discussion around, sorry, fear of failure, I should also mention, sort of came out as
Mm.
well. And then there was a discussion around sort of time management slash inability to prioritize, which was quite interesting also. So there was a discussion around the fact that sometimes these athletes um, are considered to not be very good in how they manage their time. But actually, as I said, the discussion kind of then moved on to, well, they're actually being asked to do quite a lot. Nowadays we expect a lot of our young people. We want them to be really good athletes. We want them to be really good in school. We want them to have a great social life and spend time with family. And actually, that puts a lot of pressure on this generation also. And so, it's maybe not that they're not very good at managing their time per se. It's more that they're being asked to do an awful lot and they're just struggling to cope with all of the competing demands.
There's so much to unpack here. This is absolutely fantastic, and I suppose remiss of me not to mention earlier what you've done there for us, Julie, is sort of unpack this research paper that essentially we're here to talk about today, how to help coaches meet the psychosocial skill needs of their Generation Z athletes, a season-long investigation into swimming. And that's led by yourself, Julie, and co-authored by Joseph, Chris Seward, Mustafa Sarkar, regular guest on the Sports Psych Show, the very great Chris Harwood, and the legendary Daniel Gould, who, would I be right in saying, Julie, Professor Gould has recently retired?
He has, yes. He's just in the last sort of few months or so. I saw Dan at FEPSAC in the summer. So he's taken a step back, I think, in a number of areas, but he's continuing to work in some areas that he has a particular interest in. And this is actually one of those areas. He's very keen on the Gen Z profile and this work. He
Yeah.
was saying that, they get a really good reception when they talk about some of this stuff in the States. And a lot of people can sort of relate and feel an affiliation to some of the things we're talking about.
Well, we'll have to try and prize him away from retirement and see if he'll come on a Sports Site show to speak to us about his incredible career sometime. I want to speak to some of the things that you unpacked for us there, because this is just brilliant stuff. And I wrote down 5 strengths, and I think you mentioned there's 6. So please cover the one that I may have missed. So strong in Generation Z athletes are strong in digital communication, a great deal of sports specific knowledge. That makes sense. The YouTube generation, I suppose, the I generation, they have at their fingertips the opportunity to learn, game models, principles of play. They could be coaches, better coaches than coaches themselves, or more knowledgeable than coaches themselves. Interestingly, they're in touch with their feelings. Again, we can talk more to that in a bit. Tolerant of diversity, and they're more willing to utilize support. That's 5, Julie. Did I miss one?
No, the other one that I didn't, well, I kind of tied in with with some of the deficit areas, was they are very aspirational.
Okay.
However, as I said, it was kind of an aspirational because it's a strength and a deficit almost. And I guess that's, when we talk about this generation, we've started to discuss them as a research team, these assets as a psychosocial profile, more as kind of strengths and deficits, or, assets and characteristics. It's saying that, they will have a unique profile that's slightly different from what we've maybe seen previously. And some of these things kind of overlap their strengths and deficits, or their deficit. Do you know what I mean? It's very difficult to put it in a box. So, in terms of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing,
it's like personality characteristics, isn't it? It's like traits from personality science. They both help and they hinder, right? To be introverted can help us and can hinder us. To be extroverted can help us and hinder us. To be high conscientious can help and hinder. So it adds and feeds to the complexity of the human landscape, right? I mean, coming to you, Joseph, as somebody who is a swimming coach. You're by the pool every day. You're communicating with Generation Z athletes every day. That's you are too, Julie, but coming to you, Joseph, these strengths, if that's what we want to describe them as, is this what you're experiencing at the coalface? Athletes, young athletes who are in touch with their feelings, that they utilize support, that they are aspirational, that they have a lot of knowledge. Does that put pressure on you as a coach? Tell me about your experiences at the coalface, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the day to day in terms of what we see with athletes that I work with and athletes that I see across the country. What I found when we collated this information, and we got this through focus groups with coaches, as well as there was a pre and post workshop task that we sent out to the coaches in order to get their individual thoughts as well as collective thoughts before we got that. One that really stands out for me, and like Julie's touched on, kind of this idea of Gen Z gets a bad rap at times in terms of, is it actually Gen Z or not? Is it any different? Who knows? It's very difficult, right? What I would say is to coaches that are out there is that, look, this is what you're likely to face on a day to day when you engage in coaching. So it's important that we can identify and understand the strengths and weaknesses from that and how to challenge that in order to make good people, but good athletes as well, right? And I suppose the two come hand in hand. The one that really stood out for me was this idea of wanting to be aspirational. Now, that's kind of really exciting for me as a coach, right? They want to be good. Yeah, they want to swim at the highest level. They want to be good at school, or they want to be have a great social life. That's really, really positive. The challenge comes in. Okay, so how do we map that, or how do we use that in order to challenge people within the medium that I work in, which is coaching, right? Because there's a lot more distractions in the world, and it's so measurable now, right? Because the amount of likes you can get measures if you're having a good time or not. So how do we use that to kind of support athletes? But the underlying message is people want to do well, and that should be praised and challenged in the right direction. The digital communications a real interesting one, because all people across all generations, it's changed, right? Before we had a notice board and information would go on the notice board and that would be it. We might have to try and speak to the coach after, where now we have emails and text messages and Instagram and WhatsApp, and we can be contacted in a million different ways and different mediums, podcasts. There's all this where we can get all this information from. So it's really, how do we support athletes with the use of that when they have so many different inputs coming into them individually, and that can be quite challenging at times, but also kind of interesting in terms of how coaching may be shifting in the future.
It's interesting listening to you then. It makes me think Generation Z individuals, Generation Z athletes, the I generation, which is another term to use, are as they are because of the emergence of technology. And that technology helps and hinders them, as you alluded to there, distraction. Maybe this generation are very aspirational, in part because of the volume of achievement that they see on YouTube, on social media platforms like Twitter and Instagram. And so you do wonder if that aspiration, as I think you alluded to earlier, Julie, it's not necessarily a healthy aspiration all the time. I mean, just dwelling a little bit on that, because you highlighted this, Joe, a question for both of you, either of you. How does a coach help there from an aspirational viewpoint? I mean, is it incumbent on a coach to bring Generation Z back back down to earth. Hey, calm down. You don't have to be aspirational in all of these areas. Or we talked about perfectionist mentality as well. How do coaches deal with this? Because in part, coaching is about being aspirational. It is about pushing boundaries and borders and pushing through glass ceilings. So what is a coach to do there?
I think actually, Dan, it's kind of, you have to dig down in terms of what athletes or the person in front of you really wants, because there's so much choice for them. What do the conversations of what do you really want need to be a lot richer and a lot deeper to really understand, because of course everyone wants to be successful, right? But in reality, is it possible to be a top academic, be a top person, and do it? And especially when one of the defects was like a lack of delayed gratification, you absolutely can do all that stuff, but it's probably going to take you a lifetime to achieve it, right? So within the time that you've got with us and the time that you're coaching, what actually do you want to achieve? And that takes a lot of time, and that takes a lot of communication skills from the coach. And I know we're going to go on to talk about the intervention later on, but that was something that really came out of it, in terms of coaches probably talk too much and don't let athletes really take the time to think about that.
Yeah, so I was going to cut in there and say, I think what Joe said is 100% correct. I don't think it's on the coach to bring them down at all, and especially when you do look at some of the areas that athletes were identified as, these deficit areas. They are highly self-critical themselves. They want to do well, but then they're all continually telling themselves that they're not doing well enough, and quite low levels of self-confidence. So I don't think it's necessary to bring them down per se, but exactly what Joe has just said. The intervention. So the second part of our study was that we actually worked with coaches over a sort of 8-week period, and we presented a number of different strategies to coaches to trial within this intervention, to try and get a sense of what can coaches do. So really to try and answer the question that you've just asked, and we can go into those in more detail as you wish, but ultimately what came out of the results of the intervention was this communication, this need for coaches to communicate more effectively, more regularly, and in a deeper way, like a more kind of meaningful way with their athletes. So it's not kind of that broad brush of, oh, how's everything going, in a group setting? Yeah, great, thanks. Okay, let's jump in and get on with the session. There was some more kind of nuanced approaches around giving coaches some specific ways in which to try and enhance that communication with their athletes.
I love that, because yes, let's unpack these interventions, because as you're both speaking here, I'm visualizing beads of sweat forming on the foreheads of coaches around the world as they're listening in, because they're thinking, wow, this is really interesting, but wow, I've got to know my sport really well, have a high knowledge of my sport, principles of play, game models, etc. I've got to structure my session design, and I've got to be able to communicate in a richer, broader fashion with my athletes. Now, obviously, you're going to get some coaches who will say, well, I've just got a wet Wednesday night for 2 hours to be able to get to know my Generation Z athletes a bit better. And the world isn't perfect, and resources are scarce and limited, and we know that. But let's unpack these interventions, Julie, a little bit.
Okay, so I think everything you've said is entirely correct. I think what I would add as well with swimming is it's also quite unique in that these athletes spend the vast majority of their time with their head in the water. So the communication skills, the ability to communicate is quite limited, the opportunity.
Yes.
And you've got 20, 30 swimmers minimum across a couple of lanes. So there's a lot of health and safety aspects you've got to consider from a coaching perspective in swimming. So what we tried to kind of think about I know in swimming, and again, I will speak specifically about that because I know in other sports, I know there's been lots of work done with the FA, with the 5Cs work, and there's lots of other work, in other sports that have been trying to touch on some of this stuff. Within swimming, coaches still have a little bit of a mindset of, the psychology stuff that happens in the classroom, that happens as a workshop away from, the day-to-day kind of coaching sessions. And so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on swimming. Obviously, my own knowledge and expertise of the sport influenced that also. But we also wanted to provide coaches with just some fairly small strategies that they could integrate more effective just in their coaching, in everyday coaching sessions. It wasn't like a huge change that they had to make to their sessions. And we also encourage coaches we gave them some strategies, which I'll talk through in a second, but we also said, look, we are telling you how to do this, but you are the coach with your program, with your athletes and your swimmers. And so we really want you to kind of translate what we've said into what works for you. So it's not about just we think we know what we're talking about better than you as the coach. Think about what we've asked you to do and then consider how does that work for you in your program with your coaching style and your athletes. So one of the strategies that we proposed that was most effective, I think it was used by all coaches within the intervention, was the post-session debrief. So what I should say to begin with as well is we asked coaches to select one athlete to work with through this intervention, just so we could get a sense of scale it down before you kind of scale it up. So does it work with one particular athlete? And if it does, then how could we scale that up to work more effectively with more athletes? And then we also spoke to the athletes. So we did get a little bit of an athlete voice in here as well, which I think was interesting. So the post-session debrief was a 5-minute or a couple of minute conversation after the session, before the swimmer heads off to the changing room, where importantly, it was on the swimmer to feed back to the coach. So the coach would say, okay, this is your debrief session. Tell me how that went. Tell me how the session, what you thought about the session, any feedback, positive, negative, etc. And then really the coach needed to be quiet. And Joe will probably testify to this. That was probably one of the hardest things. I think coaches, certainly in my experience of swimming coaches, is they always feel they've got to have an answer and have information and be the person in control of that conversation. Whereas actually we were saying, no, even if the athlete had nothing to say to you, we needed you to not take control of that conversation. And perhaps, and the coach has fed back, the results sort of speak for themselves in many ways. Yeah, those first few interactions of that post-session debrief were difficult. The athletes maybe didn't have a lot to say, didn't know what to say. But then as they understood the purpose that actually this is on me to have something to tell you and you want to actually listen to me, then the athletes had a lot to say. They did have a lot of feedback to provide, and just that simple process appeared from the feedback that we got from coaches to have quite a significant impact in terms of enhancing that communication and ultimately in helping the coach get to know their athlete a little bit more than what they previously did.
I love that. And coming to you, Joseph, I mean, I know you were a research assistant on this project, but coming back to your swimming coaching, you may have had a debrief in place prior to this, but was your own debrief enhanced by being a research assistant on this project?
Yes, absolutely. And look, we've all been guilty of it, especially in the sport kind of swimming. The competition environment's quite a good example to use, right? Because a swimmer will swim a time and they'll look at that on the board, and the coach will look at the board independently. An opinion will be both formed by both parties, and then they'll meet together, and then there'll be a discussion, kind of a debrief around that. The same will happen in the training environment. And really, we spoke about this before on the podcast in terms of coaching is changing. I think it's definitely being driven from an academic point of view, but this idea that when we started, it was coach centered, Adrian Morehouse's coach, Terry Dennison, used to coach behind a lectern, and he didn't move, and that was it. And it was his arena.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Adrian Morehouse, 1988
Yeah,
Seoul Olympics gold medalist. His coach behind a
yeah,
lectern.
yeah, absolutely.
That's fantastic. Was he wearing a gown and a cape and a hat as well? Oh, awesome! What great image.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
sorry, Joe.
then we kind of moved towards like athlete centered. Really, what this brought home to me was that kind of coach athlete dichotomy, and we kind of need to work with each other. And it's actually letting the athletes come to you. Coaches, we have a very keen tendency to, we are the coach. So that means we must know, and then we must intervene and tell them, and lots of times I see on poolside, athletes don't feed anything back. The coach gives them the information, and they nod their head and they go back to swim down, and that's as far as it goes. I think specifically with this generation, because of the fact that they can find out so much more knowledge, they can look at YouTube videos of swimming technique, they can find out what Caleb Dressel's training is, they can find out what's happening in Manchester, they can find out there aren't really that many secrets for them anymore. So really the success in coaching is going to be that ability to work together in the future. And the debriefs is one prime example of allowing athletes to kind of be a little bit more, take more of a leadership role within it, and kind of give coaches information themselves, and that's really important as we move forward with this generation, allowing them to have a voice, specifically because an example sticks in my mind of a coach that did a debrief. We should say these debriefs weren't always face to face because coaches are busy. Sometimes they were phone calls or voice notes, which allowed coaches not to interrupt. Right, a voice note, the athlete has to say everything they think. And he came back as we spoke to him for our weekly catch-ups. He was like, I couldn't believe how much he knew. I couldn't believe it. Like, I thought someone else was speaking and wrote this. And what that made me do is that made me speed up his development, because we went to more nuanced things around the sport. So it's really important that we kind of encourage this, promote this. It has a big impact on relationships, and it's not so much a tick box exercise. What I mean by that is, oh yes, I do debriefs and I talk to an athlete for 2 minutes and then off they go. So that's where that richness is going to come in, and that's where I think good coaching starts.
Well, the devil is going to be in the detail, isn't it? The richness comes through by the coach's capacity to engage in, to use your term, a richer conversation, Joe. And something you said there really interested me. It all really interested me, but something specific that interested me was when you talked about a swimmer completing whether it's a race or a practice session, and looking at the scoreboard or considering their time. And what we know as psychologists is there is an instant narrative there around that time, that performance. And when we relate that to the characteristics that Generation Z athletes bring to the pool, to the court, to the course, to the pitch, if research has demonstrated a sense of perfectionism, an aspirational mindset, but one perhaps struggles with delayed gratification, maybe a mindset that's oriented towards low self-confidence and a lack of resilient behavior at times, maybe a fear of failure, then one could deduce that narrative might be quite negative, certainly judgmental of that time. And so subsequently, it's perhaps incumbent on the coach to be able to help that athlete manage that narrative straight after the swim. And that's where the debrief comes in. No question, guys, but just a thought with relation to what's been said there.
Yes, absolutely. There's been some really good work, and Julie's really been involved in that, kind of pushing the process of swimming, because times are a very big judge, right? We measure things between 0.01. No one's perfect every single time, and that's really important that we do that. But it's also important to acknowledge that time is there, and it is a measure of success, and lots of things in sport are measured by that.
Yeah.
So it's sort of navigating that both elements are important, and you haven't got to be perfect every single swim, because that's unrealistic.
Yeah. I mean, I would also say, though, I think that's where this debrief and the athlete driven aspect really comes in, because, like you say, if we need to know whether that's positive or negative so the coach can respond appropriately. Like if you make assumptions as to how that athlete is evaluating their performance, then ultimately you're not going to be able to help them navigate that process to greatest effect. If you assume that they must be happy or sad or whatever, then you can't help them navigate that. So that's where, and I think as Joe, it certainly was my experience as a swimmer, you went up, you asked the coach for their feedback, they gave you your feedback, and you went off to the cool down pool with your own thoughts in mind, and often cried many tears in the swim down pool, and no one can tell because your head's in the water, your face is wet already, so it's a safe environment to do that. But it's not necessarily healthy to have all of those thoughts kind of churning over in your head always. So I feel like, yeah, absolutely, it's where coaches need to just, it kind of reminds me of so Chris Harwood back in 2008 did this study, football study, the first 5C study, and talked about coach efficacy. They have the skills and they have but it's the confidence to know that you don't have to always give the information. You don't have to give your role is not to provide the swimmers with knowledge. And that's what I've kind of listening to Joe as well and reflecting on what we found. They've got this high knowledge of the sport. Previously, coaching was perhaps, to give knowledge and to guide from that very technical, tactical perspective. But now that's not necessarily, it is to some extent, don't get me wrong, but it's not necessarily all of the role, and it's not necessarily as much of a percentage of what the coach's role is. It's more about helping that individual make sense of their experience in sport, whether that's in competition, whether that's in training, whether that's just broadly around whether they still want to do it or not, and so in order to help them do that, the athlete has to feel confident and able to share how they're feeling. So then the coach can react to that more effectively. And just the coaches having confidence that that's a really important aspect of their role, and if that's what they do, if they're quiet whilst the swimmer is in front of them, and that's okay. That's providing that space and that opportunity for the swimmer to share, and teaching them that you don't always have to feel, it's that kind of, I guess, going back to some of the core psychological principles that you would have been taught, when you were learning how to be a counsellor or learning how to be a psychologist. You don't always have to fill the silence. If the silence is there, then just be comfortable with that. And the athlete will then learn to use that silence and hopefully share what they're feeling and thinking to a greater extent, perhaps.
It's really interesting, Julia. As you were speaking there, it was making me think, just as you were talking about the role of instruction, within coaching and just getting some balance. It made me think of the work of Professor Chris Cushion from Loughborough University, who's been on the podcast a couple of times. And then, he talks about instruction as a behaviour and instruction as in direct instruction, and the differences between the two. And instruction as a behaviour is much more robust. It's asking questions. It's dealing with responses in an appropriate fashion. It's uncovering what in your case the swimmer is thinking and feeling. So I think I hear what you're saying. Basically, I hear that you're saying, look, what we're not saying is there's never a time for instruction. But as coaches, if we want to help Generation Z athletes who have some of these challenges, these psychosocial challenges, then our capacity to ask the right questions within a debrief, listen, reflect back what we're hearing, that is just as important as offering technical instruction as well. I did have before we move on to any other intervention that you offered up coaches for Generation Z athletes, I did have one more question about the debrief. I suppose it would be remiss of me not to ask you a debrief with 10 athletes in the pool or on the court or the course or the pitch. Because, as you mentioned earlier, Julie, swimming lessons can be 20-person deep. Joe, I'm assuming you're doing that on a daily basis as well. So how do we accommodate a debrief with multiple people in front of us?
So I think we asked coaches for some of their suggestions around this towards the end of the intervention. And ideas that were suggested was certainly within swim coaching, you'll have lane coaches as well as, the head coach. So perhaps asking the lane coach to get their lane out, once or twice a week early, and so it'll be a small group session. If there's a swimmer that you might identify who maybe in those small group sessions isn't then sharing, perhaps then just taking them to one side on a separate opportunity and trying to get them to share one-on-one with the coach. So you probably would have to scale it up a little bit to be sort of a more group-based activity. That said, that kind of ties into some of the other, I won't go into a lot of detail because I'm going to give Joe the opportunity to give his input on that also. But, I think there's a lot to learn from listening to others in our peer group around how they're reflecting on the session or the competitive experience, and, how they cope with, difficult sessions, etc. So I think to scale it up to a small group activity or sort of a lane at a time, once a week or so, I don't think is a bad thing, but it would take a little bit of just awareness of the coach to check that, that there's not one or two swimmers that are just, capitalizing or monopolizing that conversation too much.
Joe, do you want to come in at all there?
Yeah, like it is challenging and it is difficult, and we have to acknowledge that's the reality of the sport we're in. I think it's important to kind of remember that just because it's said after session debrief, that doesn't necessarily have to be the moment that they touch the wall and they finish the session.
Yeah.
So an example was some of the athletes were in private schools, and that happened at lunchtime, the debrief. So coaches making themselves available doesn't necessarily need to be straight away after the session. For coaches to utilize technology, so coaches use WhatsApp voice notes. It's a lot easier than writing or talking about it. But then also using senior members of the program that have done that before. You can still have a coach in the water as an athlete. There's people that fulfill those roles in there, and there's a support element to that, especially because we've already identified that support within this generation, they utilize it better. So it doesn't necessarily have to be from the coach that's running that session. And then also I'll say, like, no coach does it alone. So there's a team of coaches that can facilitate that, especially in my program, right? A lot of the athletes come from the squad below, they'll come into my squad, they'll potentially move to a different squad. So coaches are quite familiar with all the athletes, and actually it might be advantageous for a conversation to be had with not the direct coach within it, someone that's supporting around that. So there are tricks and ways around it, but it is challenging, it is difficult, and obviously scaling up 5 minutes with 30 athletes turns into a lot of workload with the coach. So yeah,
simple idea, but not easy to execute. We've got a bit of time. I'd really like to unpack another intervention if possible. We've talked about feedback there. I mean, back to you, Julie. Were there any other interventions that shone through that coaches found really useful?
I think there's probably two others. I'll kind of highlight both of those, and then perhaps there might be one that you find most interesting. So one of the interventions kind of ties in quite nicely with what we've just said around, there was a challenge session. So the idea of this comes from some of the resilience literature, some of the work that Mustafa would do. So the idea is that you would set quite a really challenging session, that almost a feel session that you expect the athletes to perhaps feel or really struggle to complete. The premise here was that you set it up so you explained to them what you were going to ask them to do and why you were asking them to do it. So there was a lot of support provided, like rationale given. And then after the session, the idea was a group kind of debrief. So again, getting the lean together. And we asked some of the coaches to prime even maybe some of their more confident athletes, some of their more senior athletes, to share what they found challenging about the session and how they coped with that. So trying to get, again, so in those in-person communication skills, trying to enhance that. It tried to tap into some of the perhaps low resilience by getting them to deal with challenging situations within training, and then to learn from each other and understand that, you know, even the athletes in your squad that you maybe look up to and that you maybe think are so much better than you actually also struggle at times and find things difficult. But then giving them the opportunity to understand and learn from each other in terms of some of the different strategies that they might use to kind of overcome some of those challenges. And the other one which we found was really useful, which I think it took me a little bit by surprise, because again, some of this control aspect from some coaches, we asked coaches to give the swimmers the opportunity to either write a set within a session, if that's what they were more comfortable with, or write a whole session themselves. So within swimming, you would have sort of a 2-hour session, and it would be very prescriptive. You know, you would have the coach would have already written what the warm up will be, what the preset will be, what the main set would be, and the cool down, and that's always prescribed to the athlete. Sometimes coaches will tell athletes prior to the session, you know, ahead of time, what they're going to do. Often it's written up on a whiteboard, you know, at the side of the pool. But what we asked was perhaps that you could let the swimmer write their own session. And then, so again, trying to capitalize on that knowledge of the sport, that their strength that they have. And then in order to try and enhance some of those in-person communication skills, the swimmer then had to explain to the squad what the session was and to take them through it. So kind of become the coach for that session. And that one in particular, I have to say, I found, you know, again, many of the coaches discussed how they were surprised by the sessions that the athletes wrote. They were really quite challenging sessions, perhaps harder than they would have written themselves, you know, the coach would have written for the athlete. And actually the whole squad really seemed to engage with the session because they knew that it had been written by one of their own, so to speak, one of their peers. So again, that those were kind of 2 additional strategies that we used.
That's really interesting. So the latter one, let's call it a player-driven, or in this instance, a swimmer-driven session. So a session plan written by the swimmer. That was utilised, I suppose, not just to increase the knowledge of the swimmer, but actually, in this case, not at all, because what we're saying is Generation Z athletes are highly knowledgeable, but it was actually utilised in order to improve the communication of the swimmers, the athletes themselves. And then the other intervention was high challenge. So, as you mentioned, in the resilience literature, Mustafa Sarkar talks about high challenge, high support, incorporating session designs that offer high challenge environments, tasks, activities, perhaps in order to help Generation Z athletes experience success in a challenging environment and to look to role model others as they succeed in those challenging environments and challenging activities. That's what I'm hearing. Joe, what do these 2 interventions mean to you?
Yeah, so the findings kind of indicate that it made athletes felt like they were cared for and they were more involved in the coaching process.
Okay.
I think coaches were pleasantly surprised in terms of the idea of their work ethic and their willingness to work hard for themselves and for each other. But really, what I think the main areas that kind of helped this intervention was the fact that, like, getting the athlete's input, especially with this generation, is vital to have successful relationships. And setting up the environment. And I think it's probably important to say this is not coaches going, okay, so you do it all and I have nothing to do with it. These sessions were once or twice a week, and the coach, there was structure around it, but giving athletes a little bit more autonomy seemed to really enhance them. And the coaches got a lot from the athlete in terms of being able to check and challenge where those athletes were, their understanding of what they think they need to do in order to improve, and where they are in the season. I think that's really important, because look, all athletes are different and they're all an experiment. There's no one rule to getting them to where they want to go. So that kind of exploratory behaviour together, I think, is really, really important with this generation, and seem to have a big impact from coaches and athletes.
Just doing some sense making here as you're speaking, Joe, and there won't be a question here, but I'd love to get both of your responses from this. I mean, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the work of Dr. Sergio Lara Bercial and the leadership around compassionate benevolence, his work with Cliff Mallet on effective leadership as a coach. I'm thinking of transformational leadership. We've spoken a lot recently on Sports Psych Show around transformational leadership, being inspiring, intellectual stimulation. A lot of what you're speaking about speaks to that, I think. Obviously, I'm thinking also of motivation and self-determination, helping athletes experience autonomy. And also, Joe, I'm thinking back to our previous podcast alongside Laura Healy, and just that coach-athlete relationship and the personality characteristics, how they match up, the personality characteristics of the coach, the personality characteristics of the athlete, and of course, not to forget the great work of Professor Sophia Jarrett from Loughborough University on coach-athlete relationships. So there feels like a lovely tie-in here from so much research spread far and wide. As I said, no question, just a thought process from me there. I don't know if you have any response at all.
I mean, I particularly am pleased to hear that, because, I guess we kind of had that. We tried to make sure that, yes, the strategies that we were suggesting, could work in practice and made sense from a practical perspective, and from a, like, just a kind of that you get a feel that, this could work. And then almost you go back to the literature and sort of say, well, actually, for example, the autonomy stuff, the motivational climate, those sorts of things is something that I've, been very, my early work had been very driven by. Sophia Jarrett, like you said, we've talked about how some of the strategies perhaps, or some of the outcomes linked to some of that closeness and co-orientation aspects, the kind of each of the coach and the athlete getting to know each other more effectively. So that co-orientation angle that Sophia talks about. So we did try to make sure that, yes, it made sense from a practical coaching perspective, but that there was a theoretical underpinning to these strategies that you could trace through the literature to say that this should work because of the research that's demonstrated some of these links previously between some of these behaviors and the outcomes that we're looking for. So I'm pleased. I'm pleased to hear that you can kind of make some of those connections. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll come to you in a second here, Joe, because it also makes me think of, at no stage, coming back to what I said earlier about Professor Chris Cushion and his work around what is instruction. I spoke with him and Dr. Ed Cope about instruction and about teaching, and it feels like at no stage are either of you, suggesting for one second that coaches shouldn't have expertise and coaches can't use their expertise, but that expertise needs to be applied in a sophisticated manner, marinated in effective instruction, whatever that instruction looks like. Joe, you're not saying, hey, forget about your expertise. It's just about empowering an athlete to come up with their own solutions. Like, that can exist, but we need coaches who still have a strong expertise to be able to meet the needs and demands of Generation Z athletes.
Yes, absolutely. I think what's really nice in terms of this piece of work is you're right. There's lots of avenues to go down, and there's lots of big areas of research. But actually intervening and actually going into pool environments and working with athletes isn't done that often, predominantly because it's really hard and it's really difficult to do that. And I think this study's starting to do that, and I hope that work like this continues, because trialing stuff and intervening is really, coaches do that on a daily basis. So it's just trying to inform their practice to speed that process up so that everyone can be successful.
If I could sort of jump back in there, I think I would also say, what we're trying to do through this project and this research is to broaden the coach's expertise, not to narrow it, but to broaden it to actually say, I think coach education, again, I can only really speak for swimming, to be honest, but has predominantly focused on physiological development, on physiology, teaching coaches about, how the training that they can do with their athletes can help to develop physical strengths, technical strengths, how they can make their athletes increase VO2 max and, help them athletes get fitter and faster and stronger. We have I'm not saying that we haven't done psychology. I mean, as Joe mentioned right early on at the beginning of the podcast, or perhaps even at the preamble before, I've done coach education work, teaching or helping coaches understand the psychological aspects of swimming, since the middle to early 2000s. And there's always been kind of psychology education, but it's been one module perhaps within like a much bigger kind of module. And then also it's about helping coaches translate that knowledge into practice. And I think that's what we've tried to really do with this intervention is actually by giving coaches specific strategies, very small things. One of the coaches, or a couple of the coaches actually said, I thought I was doing this already. I would have said, I do that. But actually, by doing specifically what you've asked me to do, I've realized that I wasn't doing it, or I wasn't doing it as effectively as I perhaps could be, or it wasn't really kind of unpicking what we were wanting to unpick. So I think, it's not about limiting the expertise. It's saying that actually coaches have a huge amount of expertise. And again, going back to that confidence, you've got the skills and it's just knowing how and when to apply those skills. So that's probably what I would say around that. And it kind of links in a little bit as well to one of the broader mechanisms that we uncovered when we analysed the data. So we had lots of specific focus on the strategies and the impact of those strategies on the athletes. But one of the mechanisms of this intervention more broadly was the reflective practice. So by us talking to the coaches on a regular basis, we spoke to coaches on a weekly basis, getting them to explain to us what they'd done. And the outcome of that, we encouraged coaches to reflect on what they were doing more than maybe they may normally reflect on their practice. And that reflective practice then meant that the coaches could identify themselves some of the areas that they perhaps thought, oh, actually, yes, I've just told you this. I need to remember that. And when I meet the swimmer next week, I'll, talk to them in this way, or I'll engage with them slightly differently. It helped them kind of refine some of the strategies a little bit, which in turn kind of, helped them more effectively meet the psychosocial skill needs of their athletes.
I love it. And as you're speaking there, Julie, it's making me think of, I guess I'm horribly biased as a sports psychologist, but I always say that the biopsychosocial component or components are constantly present. That's not to suggest for 1 second that biopsychosocial is more important than technical, tactical, physical, but we need to keep helping coaches find ways to both understand and apply this notion of, I suppose what Dr. Fergus Connolly said to me on the Sports Psych show a few years ago. He's a sports scientist and not a sports psychologist, but he said, look, I see psychology as being omnipresent, which is probably a far more eloquent way to put it. It's always present. It's always there. Again, that's not to suggest that it's more important than other components, but it is to suggest that we need to find mechanisms to help coaches exploit this constant presence of biopsychosocial. So, yeah, I love it. I love it. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I can't thank you both enough for coming on and sharing your fantastic work. And I know you will have tapped the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience. So, Julie, let's come to you first. How can people find you if you want to be found? I know you do social media. You're on Twitter. So how can people follow you, and how can people find your work?
Okay, so yeah, I am on Twitter. I don't know my handle though. As you said that, I was thinking I'm not sure. So yeah, I am on Twitter. It's at Jules P Johnston. That's Johnston. Yeah, and also, as I said, I'm a member of staff at Nottingham Trent University. So I've got a staff profile page there, which has got links to my social media and email, etc. So those are probably the best ways to find me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Julie. And Joseph?
Yeah, the best way to get in contact is obviously Twitter. My handle's just at J_Stanford, Stanford, but the O is a 0. Or just contact me via email at joseph.stanford@ntu.ac.uk.
Fantastic. Well, I can't thank you both enough. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that conversation, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So if you do have any suggestions, please do get in contact via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.